All right, so this is the first video for 155. This is about functions, domain, range, determining whether a relationship is a function. So I'm just going to run through the evens and I'll leave the odds for you to think about. But so here we go. This first one, number 2, says find the domain and range of each relation. So we take a look at this and you go, okay, so -5 gives me -4. Remember, the input is the domain, the output is the range. When it's listed as an ordered pair, the first one's the input, the second one's the output. So we'd say, all right, well, what's the domain? So the domain is going to be what? -5, -4, 0, 1, and 2. And then the range, that's just going to be the outputs. So that's going to be -4, 2, 2 again. I don't need to list it again. 3 and 4. So that's number 2. Number 4 says, determine whether each of the following relations is a function. So here I've just got a set of ordered pairs of inputs and outputs, right? And so 0 gives me 0, 1 gives me 1, 4 gives me 2, and 1 gives me -1. So remember, the definition of a function says it's a relationship where for each input, or for each element of the domain, it gets paired with one and only one element of the range. So 0 gives me 0, and 0 doesn't give me anything else. 1 gives me 1, and 1 doesn't give me anything else. 4 gives me 2, but 1 gives me -1, right? So this one gives me a 1, and then this one gives me a -1. So if I said, hey, your input value is 1, what's your output value? You have a choice. Therefore, this is not a function. So for number 4, that thing is not a function, right? Because 1 gets mapped to do different things. 1 gets mapped to 1, and 1 gets mapped to -1. So therefore, nope, not a function. All right, number 6. So now we do the same analysis. We take a look at this and we say, all right, so what happens? 3 gives me -2, 1 gives me 0, but 0 gives me -1, but 0 also gives me 0, right? So once you have a choice like that, that means it's not a function. So number 6, also not a function. Number 8. So we take a look at this thing. We go, all right, so for each x, for each input, there can be only one y, one output. Well, notice, like at x equals 0, well, 0 gives me 0, 0 gives me 1, and 0 also gives me -2, right? So remember, we call that the vertical line test. And so the vertical line is just picking some x value. So like if I pick x equals 2, that's the line x equals 2, right? There's only one output for x equals 2. But if I pick x equals -2, there's multiple outputs, right there, right there, right there. So therefore, this is not a function. As opposed to, for example, number 7 here, right? So for each x, there's only one y that goes with it, right? So this passes the vertical line test no matter where you draw that vertical line. Number 10. 10 says evaluate each function rule for x equals 3. All that means is we're going to take this equation, right? F of x equals -x minus 3. Remember, f of x, that just means the output for the function when x is x, right? So if x is x, then I get -x plus 3. But if x is 3, then what do I get? So for number 10, it says f of x equals -x plus 3. So what's f of 3? Well, that's going to be -3 plus 3, which is 0. So that means I can write that as the point x equals 3, y equals 0, or I can also say f of 3 is equal to 0. Either way is fine. Number 12. 12 says h of x is -1/2 x minus 1/2. So I've got h of x equals -1/2 x minus 1/2. So I'm going to do, well, what's h of 3 again? So that's -1/2 times 3 minus 1/2. So negative half of 3, right? Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3 over 2. So there's negative half of 3 minus an additional half. So that's negative 4 over 2, which gives me negative 2. Number 14. 14 says g of x equals negative x over 6 plus 3 halves. So g of x equals negative x over 6 plus 3 halves. So we're going to do g of 3 equals negative 3 over 6 plus 3 halves. So this is what? Negative a half. So negative 1 half plus 3 halves. That's 2 halves, right? So 3 plus a negative 1, that's 2. So, and 2 over 2 is 1. So again, I could write that as g of 3 equals 1, or I could write it as the ordered pair 3, 1, either of which is fine. So number 16. Says f of x is negative 1 half x plus 1. So now we're evaluating the function rule for x equals negative a half. So it says, this is number 16. So it says f of x equals negative 1 half x plus 1. And we're doing, x is negative a half. So we're doing f of negative 1 half is negative 1 half times negative 1 half plus 1. So this is what? Negative times a negative is a positive, and a half times a half is 1/4 plus 1. So this is 1/4 plus 4/4, which is 5/4. So I've got f of negative 1 half equals 5/4. And again, I could write that as negative 1 half comma 5/4. Number 18. H of x equals x minus a half. So we're doing h of negative 1 half, the problem told us to do. So that's negative 1 half minus 1 half. So negative a half minus additional a half is what? Negative 2 halves, which is negative 1. So I've got h of negative a half equals negative 1, or I can write it as negative 1 half comma negative 1. And number 20. Number 20 says, find the range of each function for the given domain. So here's the function, f of x equals x squared plus x minus 2. And they're giving us that this is the domain of this function. So they're limiting the domain. They're just telling us that these are the only input values we can use. So I'm only allowed to plug in the negative 2, the 0, and the 1 for this particular function. So that's a little artificial because really there's any, right? I can square any number I want and then add any number I want and then subtract 2. There's no restrictions there, but they're artificially restricting us to just using the negative 2, the 0, and the 1. You're going to run into that a lot in algebra where they're going to say, hey, limit this function's domain so that it's only some specific values and then tell us what the outputs are. So number 20, we've got f of x is equal to x squared plus x minus 2. But we're restricting the domain to negative 2, 0, and 1. So let's plug in the negative 2. So we'll do f of negative 2. So that's going to be negative 2 squared minus 2 minus 2. So what is that? Negative 2 squared. So that's 4 minus 2 minus 2. So that's 4 minus 4, which is 0. So my output value here is going to be a 0. So then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to plug in 0. So now we're going to go f of 0 is 0 squared plus 0 minus 2. That's obviously, right, negative 2. So there's my next one. And then the last one, I'm going to plug in a 1. So we'll do f of 1. So that's going to be 1 squared plus 1 minus 2. So that's 1 squared is 1, plus 1 is 2. 2 minus 2 is 0. So I don't need to list it again. Now we would like to see this written in order from smallest to largest, so we'll just go ahead and rewrite that from negative 2 and 0. And there's my range. And then the last one, 22. So 22 says f of x equals, and it's negative 1/2 times the absolute value of x plus 1. Negative 1/2 times the absolute value of x plus 1. And again, we're restricting the domain so that it's negative 2, negative 1, and positive 1. So we're just going to substitute those in. So I get negative 1/2 times absolute value of negative 2 plus 1. Remember, the absolute value is just the distance that this number is from 0, and distance is always positive. So how far is negative 2 from 0, right? So that's 2. So it's 2 times negative 1/2, which is negative 1. So this gives me negative 1 plus 1, which is 0. So I plugged in negative 2, I got out 0. So there's part of the range, right? So 0. And now I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to do f of negative 1. So, oh, this really should have said f of negative 2 up here. So f of negative 1 is going to be what? Negative 1/2 times the absolute value of negative 1 plus 1. So absolute value of negative 1 is 1, times negative 1/2 is negative 1/2 plus 1. So it's 1 minus 1/2, which is 1/2. So I plugged in negative 1 and got out 1/2. Now, what about if I plug in a positive 1? If I plugged in a positive 1, right, that's just going to make this a positive 1, which is not going to change this answer at all, right? Because the absolute value of 1 is just 1. 1 times negative 1/2 is negative 1/2. So negative 1/2 plus 1 is 1/2. Get the same thing. So I don't need to list it again. So there's my range. All right, there you go. Take a look at those odd questions and see if you have any questions. You can email me or ask me about them during office hours or in class. Thanks a lot.